Good morning and welcome to Stitching with Cindy Botts. Today I'm going to do a lesson on quilting, just some basics of quilting. If you're new to quilting, I hope this gives you a lot of information and helps you on your journey. So today's lesson is going to be this 4-patch block. A 4-patch block is typically made with 4 squares of 2 alternating colors. Usually it's a light color and a dark color, and it's used in many different quilts as a filler block. It can stand alone, and it's just a real quick, easy, good starting place for a beginner quilter. Now, as you go along, you can do a 9 patch also. But let's start with this 4-patch, and let's talk about some of the basic equipment that if you don't have, you may want to purchase. Obviously, you want a nice sewing machine. It does not have to be the top of the line. I love my Singer Scholastic. It just is a really good heavy-duty machine. I also have a fancier embroidery capable machine, but for today I have my Singer out. And let's talk about some of the equipment. So I have a rotary cutter. I have a scissors. Now, tip number 1, let's talk about scissors. You do not want to use the same scissors that you use on fabric, on paper, and other things around the house. So choose a good scissors. I like a Fisker scissors myself, but there's other brands out there that are very nice and retain their sharpness. You do not want to use it on other things though. So put a tag on it if you have other people using your sewing area or getting into your things, that this is not for paper, it is for fabric only, or hide it. Tip number 1. The other thing we're going to talk about is this. This is a seam ripper. Unfortunately, we all make mistakes, and this does come in handy. When you're watching videos and other things, you will hear some people refer to this as Jack, as in Jack the Ripper. They will say comments like, I spent the night with Jack. Jack and I have been very friendly lately. They're talking about this, the seam ripper. The other thing we want to talk about are pins. And here's tip number 2. When you're sewing, do not run over your pins. It can break your needle. It can do other damage to your machine. I recommend these flathead needles. They usually are more forgiving if you do run over them, but not necessarily totally. So just be careful. Okay, so that's tip number 2. Be careful not to run over your pins. All right, so that's tip number 2. The other thing I want to show you are these clips. Now, just recently, a few months ago, my sister turned me on to these clips. I love them. I use them so much more than my pins. As you're sewing, you can see them. They really hold the material firmly, nicely in place. And if you have any kind of like arthritis, these are so much nicer than dealing with pins. Now, when I was first learning to quilt, and my aunt was showing us some of her techniques at a little quilt get together we had, she was showing us how to trace the squares onto the material and then cut it out with scissors. Now we have the rotary cutters, and we have all sorts of different rulers. This ruler here is a square ruler, and you use it to square up your things after you've sewn, like a half square triangle or just cutting out squares. So you could use this to cut out your squares from your material, especially if you're using like scraps, things like that. The square ruler comes into play quite nicely. The other thing you can do is use your long ruler and cut strips. Now, one of the things I want to talk about is that there are always, tip number 3, there are always more than one way to do something. Okay, so one thing you can do is called strip piecing. Strip piecing is when you take one strip of material, you add another strip of material to it, and you take your 1/4 inch seam and sew the 2 strips together, and then finger press. This is called finger pressing. When you just run your finger across it, you can use an iron. Tip number, I don't know, what are we at, 3 or 4? Press the dark side down, okay? So you don't want this coming up underneath the other color. So you want to press that down. If you do it the other way, some of your whiter fabrics, the blue will show through even though there's the double layer there. Okay, so you want to try as much as you can. Sometimes you can't because you're using a lot of dark fabrics, but to make sure that the dark seam allowance is underneath the dark portion of the material. Okay, and then just finger press it or use your iron to press it. Then using either the square that I just showed you or using your rotary cutter and your ruler, you can measure the square the size you want. Here's a good tip. When you're cutting with this, it is easier to cut here away from you. If you turn and try to cut this way, you're not going to be as accurate and there's more danger involved. So go ahead and make your first cut. Then I would suggest, again, another little tip here, turning your fabric around and using your ruler to measure. Okay, so I would line up this line if I wanted a 2 inch and then cut here and cutting away from me. All right, so there's another little tip for you. So I'm hoping I'm giving you quite a few tips today, especially if you are a new sewer, new quilter. And again, we are working on this 4 patch. So I have some squares that I have in my scrappy leftover bin. So when I do a quilt, there's usually things left over, and I try to make the scrappy pieces into squares so that I have them to use for a variety of different projects. And that's what I'm using today. So I took 2 of the squares and put them right sides together. Okay, when you're doing your quilting or sewing, you're going to want your fabric to be right sides together. All right, and then I just ran it under my machine using my 1/4 inch foot. Here is a 1/4 inch foot. There's a guide on the side that should keep your fabric. You keep your fabric butted up against that, and then when your needle comes down to make the seam, it should be at a 1/4 inch. Tip, they're not always accurate. So go ahead and measure it with a ruler. If it is not, you can get a piece of tape, and they sell different products also, and you can put a piece of tape here so that you will be lining up your fabric at the 1/4 inch mark. Okay, so you could have a piece of tape right there, and then you would know to run it right like that, nice and straight and through. All right, so here's my little clip, and what my clip is doing is holding the bottom 2 to the top 2 pieces, and this is called nesting. So you have this seam and this seam here, and you want to butt them right together. So this pink, you want touching this pink. You want them butted right up together, and that's called nesting. And that will give you a nice point in the middle. So this is my quick lesson on how to make a 4 patch. I hope you learned a lot. And if you're not new to quilting, I hope it was a good refresher. Have a great day. Please hit like and subscribe for more of these videos. Thank you.